We're on Samachem and Aleph 65a. It's good to see everyone today. And at the Mishnah, Rabbi Brown is not here, but I thank Rabbi Brown for taking over. Marben al Schar ve'in Marben al Mechar. Okay, well, so this Mishnah basically is a discussion of the early bird discount. So the Mishnah makes a distinction between an early bird rental discount versus an early bird sale discount. We'll explain. So in other words, you're allowed to do the early bird discount for rent, but not for a sale. Why is that? Ketzai. A guy rents out his property. The deal is 10 large coins for a whole year. However, if you're going to pay me month by month, I want 1 coin per month. So that would be 12 coins. I want 12 coins. Okay, so again, over here, he's giving him a discount for advancing him the money. Mutter, it's permitted. We'll have to explain why. Also, the guy sells the field. He says, here's the deal. If you pay me up front, it's going to be 1,000. However, if you need time to pay, meaning you're gonna plant the field, you'll wait till the harvest, you'll pay me from your profits. So then I want 1,200. So the rule is that is prohibited. Again, so a rental contract where it's $1 a month or 10 a year is permitted. A sale where it's 10 up front or 12 after the harvest is prohibited. What's the distinction? What's the difference between the first half and the second half of the Mishnah? So Rabbi Okay, the key concept here is this line. Basically, the idea here is that you're not allowed to charge more than the market rate. The market rate for a sale is defined as the price at the time of the transaction. The fact that you're charging the guy more for giving the money late, that's ribis. Because we said the critical word in ribis is what we call agar notar, waiting for payment. You're charging here for waiting for the guy's payment. The price is now at 1,000. You want to wait till the harvest, it's 1,200. That's charging for payment. However, with regard to renting, the concept again is the rental money is only due at the end of each month. So therefore, what's going on here is you're giving him a discount for his committing. The market value is actually 12 coins a year. You want to give the guy a discount, that's permitted. However, over here, it's not your payment isn't due because a rental contract is only due at the conclusion of each rental period. So keeping the limit this is not considered. This is not considered paying for waiting. Okay.
What about well, I guess a penalty for late payment is a problem as well. Then I guess
potentially, yeah. Okay. The value, the value is a coin a month. He's giving him a discount for upfront payment, and that's because the payment isn't really due until later. However, Seifa, the end of the Mishnah, Kiman Dizvini Ninu, Uboy Lemishkal Dami Me'achshav. 1 second. However, the second half of the Mishnah, because it's a sale, and therefore the payment is due up front immediately, and you're charging him more for paying you later, this is considered paying for waiting, and it is prohibited. Okay, Amar Rava says, the rabbis examined this, they sort of found a hint to this in a verse. Okay, what's the hint? Like the payment of a renter in each year, meaning that the payment for the year's rental is actually due at the conclusion of the year.
Page position, please, Rabbi.
We're at the first wide line on 65A and
Okay.
2 dots.
Right.
So over here, the guy makes the sale, and he says, if you pay me later, I'm going to charge. I'm charging you an increased cost. Okay, so now we get to the idea of the early bird discount. So we have a few different possibilities here. Amar of Nachman. Rav Nachman says, Trosha Shari. Okay, this basically is the Trosha of Rav Nachman. Trosha here means like a discount. The Trosha of Rav Nachman, the discount of Rav Nachman is permitted. Why? Because Rav Nachman didn't talk about it. He didn't specify, pay me now and get it for 1,000, pay me later and get it for 1,200. What Rav Nachman would say is, he would sell something at more than market prices, and he would say, and you could pay me after the harvest. So it was for Rav Nachman to say, pay me now for 1,000, pay me later for 1,200, that would be prohibited. Rav Nachman didn't talk about payment now. He said, look, here's the deal. It's 1,200, the price of later. Later, you owe me the money later. You don't have to pay me now. Some say it was Rav Ukva Bar Chama of Nachman. The mission says paying for waiting, charging the guy more for paying you later is prohibited. So Rav Nachman felt it was different because in the mission the guy told him 1,000 now, 1,200 later. That's prohibited. But Rav Nachman's scenario where he wasn't told anything about paying now, so Rav Nachman felt that was permitted. However, there were other versions of sales. Amar Papa says, "Trust the Shari." My sale, that's for sure permitted. Okay, Rav Papa was a seller of date liquor. Is that I don't remember what's like? Was that, is that arak? Is arak made out of dates? Not sure. Some sort of date liquor, date.
This was a beer merchant.
Beer merchant. Okay, interesting. Sheikh tomorrow. It was date beer.
But
date
palm wine also could be.
I mean, you realize what it means if, for example, you undercharge them for dates, cheap dates.
Yeah. Okay. Our Papa, trust the Shari. So Papa used to have this following arrangement. My time. 1 second. Okay. What Rav Papa would do is that there was, I guess, multiple parts of the date wine season, date palm wine season, and he would charge the later price in an earlier time. So, for example, let's say in fall it was cheap. It was $5 a bottle, and in the spring it was $8 a bottle. He would sell it in the winter and charge this. He would sell it in the fall and charge the spring price $8 a bottle. But he told him you could pay me in spring. You have to pay me now. So he says this is different. Why? It's my beverage is not going to go sour. This is a beverage apparently that doesn't turn into vinegar. Okay. 1 second. Zuzi letzerichna, and Rav Papa was saying about himself, he's very wealthy. He doesn't need the money. So I know who to kavin the milsa gabelakach. And I'm sort of helping them out by giving them more time to be able to pay. So I'm Rav Sheshes buried your video of Papa. So Rav Sheshes says to Rav Papa, hold on a second. My chazi married the kaazas basar didach zil basar ditu. Rav Papa is advertising that his sales permitted. Why? Because from Rav Papa's perspective, this isn't considered paying for waiting, charging more for paying later. But Rav Sheshes says, well, flip the coin now. Look at it from the buyer's perspective. Had he had the money available now, you think he would wait to pay you in spring? No, he'd buy it for $5 a bottle now. The fact the buyer is waiting till spring is indicative that the buyer considers himself paying ribbis. So I don't care that you, the seller, don't consider this to be ribbis, charging for paying later. But from the buyer's perspective, it should be. 1 second. The ilo havlu zuzi have a shakli ki hashla. Hash the less luzuzi shakli ki yukr lekame. 1 second. 1 second. Okay, basically now that there's no money, you pay the, because they don't have money readily available now, they're paying the more expensive price of later. Okay, Omer of Chomo. So now we get to the sale of Rav Papa and the sale of Rav Nachman, these were sort of questionable. Now we get to the final sale, which is the deal of Rav Choma. So Rav Choma had an interesting business model. This is what he would do. He would sell expensive things in a cheap city. So you think of a coffee, right? In Rick Rail, Oregon, coffee is probably $1, right? And if you go to downtown Portland, coffee, I guess, is $3, $5, $7, let's say.
Just for plain coffee?
So here's what Rapap would do. He would go to Rick Rail, and he would sell them the coffee for $8. But the deal was as follows. He would give them maybe would sell them to $7.50, and you'd tell them you travel from Rick Rail to downtown and sell the coffee in downtown. And if the coffee is lost in the way, it's my responsibility. So basically, he would take the community of Rick Rail and have them serve as his brokers. They'd agree to buy it for him there at an expensive price, but a little less expensive than the expensive location. Then they'd carry the merchandise to the expensive location and sell it there. And they'd pull a small profit and come back. Now, Rapapa was responsible for the coffee to get from Rick Rail to downtown, but the brokers were responsible for bringing the money back. So over here, Rapapa is saying there's no ribbons here. Why? Because the sale doesn't really commence until the item is sold in downtown, because Rapapa has accepted responsibility of the travel from Rick Rail to downtown. So therefore, the loan sort of begins once the item is sold. Well, the item is sold in a more expensive place at a more expensive value, and a little bit more expensive than the sale that Rapapa made it.
Yeah.
So that's the case. This is perfectly legitimate, and there's no interest here. So my sale is for sure permitted. My time. Now, so you might be thinking, why are these people sort of buying the coffee from Rapapa at $7.50 to sell it for $8 in downtown? Why don't they just buy the coffee for $1 themselves and bring it? Yeah. Is what go to the local coffee. The answer is very simple, because Rapapa was a very well-connected guy. If you put on your wagon, Rapapa's merchandise, then you'd be exempt from taxes, and the rule was that you had the first rights in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. So nobody would be able to sell their coffee until your truck was finished.
That's how it works. That's the rule for rabbis. Right?
No, the rule this wasn't a rule for rabbis. This was a rule because Rapapa was very, very well connected.
I'm
sorry, Rav Chama. Sorry, Rav Chama. Rav Chama was extremely well connected. He had close relationships with the Exilarch, so therefore he had sort of everyone had to respect his exactly. So you were basically capitalizing on his name, trading his name, and this is permitted. Okay. Top of 65b, first word on the page. The halacha follows the opinion of Rav Kamma. Such type of relationship is permitted. Secondly, for Elazar. The halacha follows the law of Rabbi Elazar. You probably saw that a little bit yesterday with Rabbi Brown. That ribis ketzutza yaitze b'dayanim. If you charge authentic ribis, we said authentic ribis is very simple. It has to be specified before the loan, and it has to be in the context of a loan. That's all you need. And if you pay ribis ketzutza, then the rabbis are able to confiscate the interest and return it to the borrower. By the way, the borrower is prohibited to pay interest as well. So the law of interest is not just for the lender to charge; it's for the borrower to pay it. Okay. Next, the law follows Rabbi Yanai that says, what's the difference between it or its money? Meaning, according to Rabbi Yanai, if you're due to make a scheduled payment of a loan in fruit, you can switch it for wine, and switch it for grapes or grain or something like that, or flour, etc. Because once there's a market price, then there's no difference between paying $100 or paying $100 of wine. It's exactly the same thing, and therefore that's permitted. It doesn't look like ribis. Mishnah. Okay, so now we get into another set of complicated territory. We've already approached this once. This was probably on Erev Yom Tov. It was on Sunday. I believe. We spoke about this on Sunday, which was we mentioned sad echad beribis, or how a sale could turn into ribis. How does this happen? So a guy sells a field. The nosan loy mixes domim. So there was Reuven, he was the seller, and Shimon's the buyer. So Reuven's selling the field to Shimon. Shimon gives him half the payment, let's say. Gives him half the value. And he says to him, so the seller, Reuven, says to Shimon, make the next payment and take away the field. Meaning that until Shimon makes the second payment, the field is in the domain of Reuven. Also, this is prohibited. Why is this prohibited? Because two things will happen. Well, the Gemara will explain that over here the sale commences at the moment the first amount of money was paid. Okay, so on Sunday, Shimon pays Reuven half the value. Right? At this point, according to Reuven, the field is sold now to Shimon. But he's not letting Shimon take the field until he makes the next payment, which he makes 3 months later. Now, Reuven uses the field for 3 months. That is ribis. Why? Because when he makes the payment, retroactively the field was his on Sunday. Because that's when they agreed the sale was going to be. So Reuven's selling the field, holding on to money for 3 months, and the interest is that he gets to use the fields. So this is prohibited. Okay, we'll soon see that not only is it prohibited for Reuven, it's actually also prohibited for Shimon. Why? Because what happens if Shimon doesn't come through with the second payment?
Foreclosure?
Well, then Reuven refunds him the down payment.
Okay.
And the 50% payment. And it turns out Shimon was using the field for ribis. So we'll get to that in the Gemara in a moment. Okay. Hilveo al Sadeo. A guy makes a loan on a field, and he specifies the field should be a collateral. We have 3 years to pay me back. If not, Harei Shali, the field is mine. Then Harei Shalai, then the field is yours. There's nothing wrong with that. There was a man whose name was Baisis ben Zunin, and he apparently was a pretty tactful money lender. And this is what he would do. You wanted to borrow money, you have to put up property as a collateral. So the Gemara says, Mi'echel Paris, who gets to eat the fruits of the field while the field is sort of in limbo? So Rav Huna says, Mi'echel Paris, the seller eats the fruit. Rav Onan Omar, Mishalshin es a Paris. Rav Onan says we appoint a custodian, third party. V'loy pligi, there's no debate. It depends the relationship. If Reuven says to Shimon, thank you for the 50% payment, when you get the next 50%, the field will be sold to you then. So until then, the field belongs to Reuven. So Reuven's allowed to eat the fruit. Nothing wrong with that. If, however, Reuven says the field will be yours from now, so then we appoint a third party. Because Reuven can't use it, that's ribis on the deposit. Because when Shimon makes the payment retroactively, it wasn't his. And Shimon can't use it because if Shimon doesn't make the payment, then it goes back to Reuven. So he's using Reuven's field without authorization. So therefore, it's going to be ribis both possibility of ribis both ways. So therefore, we say use a third party. Tani Rav Safra ribis to be Rav Chia. In Rav Chia's study hall, they spoke a lot about ribis. So Rav Safra taught a law of ribis. Here's the law. Pa'am sheshneim mutarim, pa'am sheshneim asurin, pa'am shamaycha muter l'kech aser, pa'am shlekech muter umaycher aser. That was a mouthful. Okay, what was that? Basically, sometimes it's prohibited for both of them. Sometimes it's permitted for both of them. Sometimes it's permitted for one and not the other. The seller without the buyer without the seller. And I'll explain each one. So Ani Rava Basrai. So Rava said it after he said this mouthful, so nobody knew what he was talking about. So Rava said, okay, let me explain it to you. It's very simple. It's possible that they're both permitted to use the field. How did that happen? The guy gave a 50% payment on the field. The guy says, no problem. From now, the south 50% is yours. So guess what happens? The buyer can use the south 50%. The seller could use the north 50%. Nothing wrong with that. It's possible they're both prohibited. He says to him, the seller says to the buyer, when you give me the other half of the money, it's yours from now. Like we explained before, this is prohibited. You have to use a custodian. Neither one's allowed to use the field because of the potential for ribis. Okay, it's possible that it's permitted for the seller and prohibited for the buyer. How did that happen? The seller says to the buyer, thank you for the 50% deposit. When you bring the other 50%, it will be yours from then. Until then, it's mine. Therefore, I'm allowed to use the field. The buyer, of course, is not allowed to use the field. It doesn't belong to him. That would be like ribbis on a loan. Okay. 1 second. So it's possible that it's permitted for the buyer and prohibited for the seller. How did that happen? The Amarlei Kani Me'achshav. V'zuzi lehevi halva. V'zuzi lehevi halva kabach. So basically, the buyer says, thank you for the payment. It's yours now. And the other 50% you owe me, we're going to consider that as full payment now, and the money is turned into a loan. So this is, again, the guy, effectively, it's like the guy made full payment, but agreed that half of it will be a loan obligation. So then he owns it immediately. Of course, the buyer is allowed to use the field because he owns the whole field. He made a full payment. He has a loan responsibility. That's a separate thing. And the seller, of course, has no rights to the field because the seller
sold it.
The seller sold it. Okay. Okay. Now we have to point out, of course, that we have the famous opinion of Rabbi Yehudah, right? Rabbi Yehudah says, Tzad echad b'ribis mutter. What does that mean? If ribis won't certainly occur, it is permitted. So let's explain. Let's go back. Mantana shnei masurim. Amar Funa, brother Rabbi Yehudah, like Rabbi Yehudah, Rabbi Yehudah, ha'amar tzad echad b'ribis mutter. Okay, let's explain. What does this mean? Let's go back to the case where the guy sells the field from now, right? Reuben sells the field from now. He gets half payment from Shimon. The second half payment is due in 3 months. Now let's allow Shimon to use the fields. Okay, what's the problem? Maybe Shimon won't make the payment, but maybe Shimon will make the payment. And if Shimon makes the payment, what happens? Then if Shimon makes the payment, then the field is transferred legitimately, retroactively from 3 months ago on Sunday. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, Shimon can use the property. Why? Because Shimon may not result in ribis. If Shimon makes the payment, there's no ribis at all. And according to Rabbi Yehudah, tzarach ribis is permitted. Therefore, our mission is not like Rabbi Yehudah. Okay, but 3/4 of down Samachem and Beis, 65b. First one is mutter. We're at the 2 dots. The first of the 2 dots. Mashkin lebayis, mashkin lesoda. The guy gives a collateral, either a house or a field. And he says, okay, so basically the deal is that so you have the lender, Reuven will be here, both the lender and the potential buyer. Shimon, of course, is the borrower and the potential seller. So Reuven lends Shimon $1,000 and specifies that the property should be collateral. There's nothing wrong with that. But what was wrong here was that Reuben said, look, Shimon, if you're thinking of selling the field, my $1,000 is the payment. That's the deal. The field, by the way, is worth $1,500. That's ribis. Of course it's ribis, because you're loaning him the money and you're specifying an overcharge potential, right? Mm-hmm. You're telling him that if he wants to sell the field, then he's forced to sell it to you at a discount. Mm-hmm. It's not fair. However, because it's collateral, what you are allowed to do is say, look, I'm going to match any deal. I have first right. So anyone who gives you a deal, I can match it and take the field. That's permitted. B'shavyein, for the value mutter, that's permitted. That's sort of a regular collateral. You have the rights to keep the collateral in case it's going to be sold. Mantana b'dom halolu aser. Who's the opinion that says for this amount of money it is prohibited? Meaning, if the guy specifies, here's the deal: if you want to sell the $1,500 field, it's bought for $1,000. Now this is obviously not like Rav Yehudah. Why? Because according to Rav Yehudah, well, maybe the guy's going to pay back, or maybe he won't sell the fields. So it might not be ribis. According to Rav Yehudah, this is permitted. And obviously the rabbis disagree. Who's the one that says you can't engage in this relationship? Rav Yehudah can't be Rav Yehudah. Dear Rav Yehudah, Amar tzarach ribis mutter. Rav Yehudah is of the opinion that says one-way ribis is permitted. And again, the rabbis say that is prohibited, and the halacha follows the opinion of the rabbis, I believe. Okay, next. Mocher lebayis, mocher lesoda. So this is the Indian giver, right? The guy says, "Here's I'm selling it." Reuven says to Shimon, I am buying Shimon's field. Shimon again is the seller, Reuven's the buyer. He's buying. Now Shimon says, hold on a second. Shimon says to Reuven, when I get money, I'd like to buy the field back from you. So basically what's going on here is the field is sort of serving like a collateralized loan, collateralized debt obligation. Mm-hmm. Effectively, it's the same thing. Why? Because he doesn't want to loan him money. So what he's doing is he's saying, okay, you're going to sell the field and I have the exclusive right to buy it back for the same value. Also, this is prohibited. Why is this prohibited? Because the interest, because this looks exactly like a loan, because effectively it really is a loan, then the use of the property constitutes the interest. So also it's prohibited. However, let's say the buyer, Reuven, volunteers, and he says, he says, look, I'm buying the property now, fair and square, 1,500. If you have 1,500, I'll sell it back to you. Mutter, it's permitted. It's permitted. Let's explain. Montana, who is the opinion? Amr Rabbi Yehudah, the Rabbi Yehudah. This obviously is not like the opinion of Yehudah. The Rabbi Yehudah, Amr Tzadach and Ribbis Mutter. According to Rabbi Yehudah, one side of Ribbis is permitted. Again, over here, maybe the seller will never have enough money to redeem the field, so there won't be any Ribbis. So therefore, it's permitted. What's the difference in the first and the second half? So Amarava Seifa the Amar Lei Midaite. The second half of the Mishnah is where the buyer volunteers. So the seller does not force the relationship; he volunteers it, and therefore it's permitted. Okay, now we get into a complicated question. Starts with the story. Okay, so this is not a good practice. This is he bought a property without bank guarantees. In America, it's the equivalent of buying a property without a title search. So as you might imagine, the buyer was getting a little antsy, right? He says it's not, what happens if somebody takes away the property? So the seller sees the buyer is getting very nervous. So don't be nervous. If they take away the property, if somebody takes away the property, I will reimburse you the most premium form of repayment. I'll give you cash. I'll give you the best property. And I'll pay for all of the increase in value and all of the fruit that you could have gotten from the property. Basically, I'll give you lock, stock, and barrel, all your investment and all your profit back from the best property. Sounds like a good deal, right? So Amar Meimar says, "Patumi mina ba'almahu." This is sort of a way to stuff his stomach, to calm him down. This is not to be taken seriously. What's the reason? Over here, it's the seller making the offer. What really should be done is the buyer should be demanding the offer, because the buyer is not demanding that the seller make this deal. The seller is sort of offering it on his own. Therefore, Amrit, we say Patumi Mila Ba'alma, it's just stomach stuffing. It's not these are just words. These are not to be taken seriously. So the Gemara points out, one second, what about the previous price? Again, this condition is a negative condition to the seller. The seller does not want this condition in the sale, right? So we say that if that's the case, the buyer must specify the condition. The seller can't just proffer it of his own accord. That's not to be taken seriously. However, we have a problem. Go back to the previous Mishnah. Okay, we'll see that. We'll just explain the question outside before we see it inside. What was the story? The story was that Reuven, the buyer, made a deal with Shimon the seller. Okay, two things could have happened. Number one, Shimon the seller could have said, I'd like to buy back my property. This is a condition that's negative to the buyer, right? The buyer doesn't want this condition. He wants to be able to keep the property. So the seller, the seller is forcing the buyer to accept the condition. I want to buy back the property whenever I have the money. We said that's prohibited because of rips. However, we said that let's say the buyer offers the seller this deal. He says to the seller, here's the deal. If you have money, you can buy it back. Mishnah says that that's permitted. Why? Because he did it of his own accord. Right? 1 second. 1 second. Now, what happens if it wasn't of his own accord? What happens if it was he was sort of pushed in, cajoled into making this deal? So the seller basically said to him, maybe I'll get a loan, maybe I shouldn't sell the property. He says to him at the closing. So the buyer says, no, you too late. You know what? If you have money, I'll let you buy it back. This is the same story. It's effectively the same story, just the reverse. And what do we say? The implication of the Mishnah is that if he, that 1 second. Okay. Now, the implication here is that this would be prohibited because of the laws of ribis, but it would be permitted. It would be permitted. The sale would be a legal sale. Now, the question is, why would the sale be legal? Again, over here, the buyer is getting and the seller is getting antsy about making the sale. So the buyer says, you know what, you get your money back. I'll give it back to you. So the Mishnah says that's prohibited because it's ribis. Forget about the ribis. Why don't we say it's patumi mili ba'almaninu? Oh, the previous scenario was the buyer was getting antsy because there was no title search, and the seller offers the deal. Over here, the seller is getting antsy because he doesn't want to sell the property. The buyer offers the deal. You can buy it back from me. In they're both identical scenarios. In either scenario, the law should be that patumi mila ba'almaninu, the sale isn't valid in the first place. It's not just a ribis question. Such a type of condition it doesn't mean anything. And just go for the resolution before we see the more inside. The resolution is very simple. When the seller makes this offer, it's always considered as if he volunteered it, even if it was the buyer who's getting it. If the buyer said to the seller, "When you have the money, I'll let you get it back," it's always considered to be of the buyer's own volition, even if it was the case that the seller was antsy. The seller was sort of nervous; he didn't want to sell it. He couldn't get a loan or something. It's always considered as if the buyer volunteered the offer, and therefore the sale is valid and there's no risk. Okay, so let's see. Fourth line of 66a. When I have the money, I'll give it back to you. That's permitted. Why is this? Again, in this case, this is the type of deal the seller should be demanding, not the buyer should be offering. Again, the deal is that if the seller has money, he can get the property back. The seller should be demanding this deal, not the buyer offering it. If the seller is very nervous, he doesn't want to sell the fields. He decides to get a loan instead. So the buyer says, no, I'll make a deal. You can go get the field back whenever you want. We say that that's prohibited. Why? Because that's ribis. Effectively, you're using the field as a loan. And the fact the buyer is able to use the property is a form of interest. It's the interest of the loan. It's just structured in a sale type. That's the problem. But 1 second, there's a different problem here. Over here, the seller didn't demand the condition. It was the buyer that offered it. In that case, we say patumi mila ba'almaninu. We say it's just word stuffing. It doesn't mean anything. So why is even a ribis problem? It's not, the whole thing is not serious. You don't have to give him back the field. It's a joke. So Amarlay, 1 second. So Amema responds to him, no. Nasa command Amarlay midayte itmar. The idea mentioned by Rava is not that the seller volunteered it, but that the seller's offer always constitutes a volunteerism. It's always considered as if he volunteered it. And because he volunteered it, therefore, the sale is valid, and there's no problem with ribis. And it's not a word stuffing because this is considered always to be his volunteer arrangement. The cajoling is not significant when it comes to the buyer. When it comes to the seller forcing a condition from the buyer. When it comes to the buyer forcing a condition from the seller, it is considered cajoling. From the other direction, from the seller cajoling it from the buyer, making the buyer volunteer a condition, it is not considered forced, and therefore the sale goes through. It's valid. And we don't consider it to be word stuffing. Okay, have a great day. Good to be back. See everybody.